Hey everyone, it's Matt Nelson here with the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm here with my colleague, Andrew Petiprin. He's a fellow of popular culture here at Word on Fire. And this is a special meeting of the two of us because this is the first time that we are bringing to you what we're calling Footnotes with the Fellows. And so over the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about some of the things we're working on. We're going to talk a little bit about more generally how we got into the things that we're working on now in life. So how did Andrew end up being the great film expert that he is here at Word on Fire, for example? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I've worked on in the world of apologetics and how I got there. And so let's just dive in. So why don't you start? I'll throw it over to you. Why don't you start by talking about some of the things you're working on right now?
Well, it's good to be together, Matt. It's fun to just kind of sit and shoot the breeze for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. And I love how you're dressed, by the way.
Thanks. For our viewers, this is kind of the Word on Fire uniform, in case you didn't know. The blue, the light blue, the dark blue, the brown shoes, and the blazer. So we're on the same page today.
Whoever the next fellows are for Footnotes with the Fellows, we'll expect them to follow the dress code. But
we'll see what happens.
But anyways, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there's, as you know, just a lot going on here with the Fellows right now. Just all kinds of stuff that we're creating, content that we're creating, both for courses and kind of the stuff that people expect in the Institute, but also a lot more public-facing stuff that we're going to be excited to share. And I have been working on a film commentary series, which I'm really, really excited to see go live in the new year, we hope, where I'm taking, instead of talking about just an individual film, I'm taking a theme and exploring some of the theology behind certain ideas and things that are relevant to us in our daily lives, and especially our work as evangelists, and using certain themes and ideas, exploring them through various films. So I'll have an episode about beauty, and I'll use 3 different Italian films to kind of explore the various ideas about beauty. So I'm super excited about this. It's a really great production. It was really, really well filmed, and I had a lot of fun writing it. And I'm already working on the next iteration of it, whenever that might be. But
well, I'm always impressed at, say, lunchtime when we're sitting down and we're having lunch as a team and everybody starts quoting films. And I'm impressed at just people who can quote films, because I watch movies. I can watch them for the 3rd time and still be unable to quote anything 5 minutes after it ends because it just for some reason doesn't stick.
Except for Home Alone 2.
Well, Home Alone 2 and Dumb and Dumber, and there might be 1 or 2
No,
other ones,
you're selling yourself short, but go ahead, yeah.
But what impresses me, though, is, number one, that we have so many people on staff that can quote just what feels like, to me, every movie ever made. But for you, it's not just quoting the movies, but I'm always impressed at how you know who directed it, who produced it, all sorts of other interesting details about the making of the film. It's fascinating, really, as somebody who hasn't really developed the connoisseur-like sentiments towards films that you have. So what I wanted to ask you, and I'm kind of sitting at your feet at this point because I'd like to learn how to be better at watching films. When did this start for you? Do you remember, as a child, were you really into watching films and watching it kind of with a critical eye, or when did that start for you?
Yeah, I've always been into watching films and listening to music. I mean, I remember, always knowing what the lineup was on MTV or the local radio station or whatever, and also films. I mean, I just always wanted to know when we would get the physical copy of the newspaper, every Friday, I wanted to know what was the new film starting that week, and I could almost always tell you what was playing at any given time.
And how old are you when this is?
Probably 7, 8, 9 years old, where I just was really enamored with the whole idea of films, filmmaking, the craft of films. But, my earliest favorite films were kind of these classic 80s and 90s adventure movies, Steven Spielberg type movies, E.T., obviously the Star Wars movies, Back to the Future, Indiana Jones, stuff like that. Yeah. Things like The Goonies, kind of classic kids adventure movies, and it just kind of goes from there. The idea that I'm having an adventure, it's not necessarily that I'm escaping my real life, but that I'm in a sense expanding my real life. I'm imagining that life is an adventure, and that there are at times good guys and bad guys, that there are journeys that have to be taken. There's usually, if it's a good film, a redemption story that happens. So yeah, films have always been a huge part of my life. And when I got into deeper into my faith and then eventually into Christian ministry, before even I came here to work at Word on Fire, before I was even a Catholic, my kind of vision of the world, including my kind of theological vision, was always kind of like run through the lens, no pun intended, of films. So like for me, when I discovered Bishop Barron and I discovered, this whole kind of way of engaging with the culture, I fell in love with it, and it's just an incredible privilege to get to do it myself now.
So when you were little Andrew sitting up on that couch and maybe covered up with a blanket, mom made you a bowl of popcorn and you're watching these movies.
Yeah.
Was there one that you would say, like, even as a child, rocked your world, that really impacted you in a like deeper existential way, even as a kid?
I'll tell you a film that did that for me, and it's the movie Chariots of Fire. The a sports film, a film about running, but
that's
also
on the Vatican film list.
It is.
Too,
it's on the Vatican
Yeah.
film list. Yeah. So it's a film that like is very much on the radar of good, faithful Catholics and Christians, and but it was a hugely successful like commercial film, and it's one that people know. And it's like a kind of classic story of two men on different journeys, but who ultimately like find themselves competing against each other, running this race, and kind of like, bringing their different lives and experiences to bear in the same environment. And Eric Liddell is one of the main characters, and he was a well-known 20th century Protestant missionary, and so obviously there's like some overtly Christian stuff that's going on in that movie. But I watched that movie over and over again on our like recorded off TV VHS tape when I was a kid, and it still stays with me as a movie that I think about a lot.
It's funny you mentioned the VHS tapes, because my family, this was like a devastating development in our family just months ago. We had this old TV with like the built-in VHS in it, and that was for a long time like that's if our kids wanted to watch television, and we were we were allowing TV time, we had a massive collection of VHSs that other people were getting rid of because they were moving past that. And it's funny, like there's going back to now watching movies on VHS. It's a different experience when now we're just used to HD everywhere, and even probably there's probably you can mention other newer technologies that take high def to like another level. But my point is that there's a sense in which like VHS has almost become sort of like listening to a record now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like collecting records or VHS tapes or even DVDs or CDs, right? Like it's kind of a different thing from streaming, because you're actually like curating a collection of things for yourself in your home. You're actually making decisions like, I like that piece of art so much that I want to have it to be able to put it on for myself or for my family at any time. We're kind of losing sight of that a little bit with the streaming, where it's sort of like, well, just binge this, binge that, take a look at this, take a look at that. That's fine. But something kind of is lost by not having like the physical object as much anymore.
Yeah, and so when our VHS TV broke a few months ago, I think the kids were fine with that, because that means they get to watch on the bigger TV. But I remember feeling a little bit I was sad, I was like, well, we have all these VHSs, so we got to go and find another one of these. But do you think that there's, just to stay on this VHS topic for a second, do you think that there's anything to be gained by watching by VHS versus watching in high def? Like, does it bring anything unique to the viewer's experience that's, maybe in some way unique enough that it's a form of advantage? Or I
wouldn't say so, but I do think that there's a big difference from watching. I mean, maybe there is a little bit, but there's definitely a big difference from watching on a big screen in a movie theater, especially if it's kind of old-fashioned one where you're watching a print of a movie that's like something that's actually made on film and then has been printed onto film and then shown to you. It is a very different experience than sitting at home or, worst case scenario, watching on your little individual device.
Sure.
I really think that watching movies is a great collective experience. It's a corporate experience. It's a wonderful thing to like share the experience of art with other people. Music is the same way. I mean, nowadays if people listen to music, it's mostly a solitary endeavor. And for most of human history, that's just not at all the way music would have been experienced. So it's something to think about.
I'm thinking about Marshall McLuhan's famous quote that it's the medium is the message.
Yeah.
And there's something nostalgic, at least, about for people like us to watch movies on a VHS, because it's what we grew up on. So, I mean, that's another thing that maybe I could ask you about is, watching a film is not just about consumption. It's about like the whole context of watching a film that really creates the experience, right? Could you say a little bit more about like, for your family, for example, like when you guys decide to watch a film together, is there any like form of ritual that comes with that? Or,
there's absolutely a ritual, and we all recognize these rituals. Making the popcorn, like you said before, everybody has like a particular place they like to sit in the living room, whatever it may be. My son likes a particular blanket, my daughter likes a different one, whatever it may be. We ritualize these experiences, and that's the thing about reality, is that we are inherently religious people, right? So everything we do is ritualized in one degree or another, and so there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we should really like highlight that and celebrate that. I think that also means that what we watch is something that we ought to really take seriously and be intentional about. Obviously nowadays it's easy, like I was saying before, just to kind of like stick something on, have something on in the background even is something that people are known to do. But a lost art is the art of actually watching uninterrupted a piece of art that has been made for you by an artist for your edification. How often is it nowadays that even if you go out of your way to put on something, you're sitting there with your phone, maybe exchanging some text messages, whatever it may be, not really experiencing the full experience. Whereas like if you go to church, if you go to Mass, there are people, sadly, who are sitting in Mass texting. But we all understand that is a taboo. We would not, we definitely would go out of our way to make that the one place where we're not looking at our phones. But we don't treat movie going that way. Not entirely anyway. So that's something that we might take a little more seriously. At least I would as a film lover. You know?
Well, so taking this back to a religious conversation, of all the movies you've seen, like again going back in time, which religious movie was the first one to really impact you in a profound way?
That's hard to say, because what does a religious movie mean? I mean, there are some like A Man for All Seasons, maybe, or, The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman is like a religious movie in a manner of speaking, even though Bergman himself was not a practicing Christian, though he was tortured, in a sense, haunted by the faith, which is why he made a movie like that. Terrence Malick's movie, A Hidden Life, is, I would say, very much a religious movie. But is it, is it a religious movie according to some people's definitions? I don't know. I tend to be somebody who is a little wary of something that is specifically offered in the marketing category of religious or Christian. Sadly, I find that sometimes the content is not as good. There are some exceptions to that, to be sure, but I tend to be more interested in just sort of like finding what, Bishop Barron talks a lot about as like the seeds of the word in things that aren't necessarily overtly Christian. But yeah, there are lots of things that have great, like, strong Christian themes in them. Chariots of Fire would be one of them. I really do think that Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman is one where if you're a practicing Christian, you come away from that movie really understanding the joy of the gospel, even though there's, it's kind of a bleak film. But
so like, what are some of the exceptions then in the religious category?
There's I'm now blanking the movie about Bernadette of Lourdes. The Song of Bernadette is a great kind of definitely like overtly Catholic movie. There are other examples like that.
Like Joan of Arc is one of the
Joan
classics.
of Arc is a great classic. Yeah, absolutely. There are several others on that Vatican film list as well. But the wonderful thing about that Vatican film list, of course, is that a lot of them aren't like that. There's a film on there like 8.5, which I've written about and talked about, where it was on the Vatican film list, but it was also on the Legion of Decency's condemned list. So it's really funny how like the church can kind of like grow in its understanding of what constitutes something good for the faithful. Right?
There's a Western, the Stagecoach is on that list, I believe.
Stagecoach is on there.
Is that Clint Eastwood or is that John Wayne?
Gosh, I'm blanking now. It's not Clint Eastwood. Maybe it must be.
John Wayne.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah. But so you hear Vatican film list, you expect a whole list of movies about saints or something like that.
Right.
It includes movies about the lives of the saints, but there's some unexpected.
Yeah, The Wizard of Oz is on there. I mean, all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so when it comes to working on these commentaries, you obviously had to have some skills developed to be able to watch film and then be able to critique them and pull out the good, the bad, and the ugly, and also take movies that maybe aren't explicitly Catholic or Christian in nature and be able to pull out something that would be really meaningful to a Catholic who's watching your commentary. So how do you develop those kinds of skills? And that's a question that I truly am interested in myself, because like I said, I'm notoriously bad at singing songs. My wife is constantly correcting me on getting lyrics wrong. And when it comes to movies, I just don't remember what I watch. I've gotten excited about watching a movie before that I've been dying to see, and my wife has had to inform me that you've watched that movie before. So I'm asking you, how do you properly develop these skills to be able to have a sort of opinion in the form of a commentary?
Well, I don't know if there's like a prescribed strategy, but for myself, I've always, I've studied languages and literature, and then eventually philosophy and theology. And so I've always loved like a close reading of texts, and I've always paid really close attention to language and to the way that humans express themselves. Okay. So I think all of that has gone into my, sort of mashing all of those things together, my ability to appreciate a film and talk about it for other people's benefit, maybe. But, film criticism is a science in a manner of speaking, but I would say it's more an art than a science. It's just something that brings me joy. It's something that I enjoy, and I'm just incredibly blessed now to get to try and put that on a page, to kind of get that onto the screen for other people. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of people who are probably a lot better at it than I am, who don't ever get a public platform, but who, when you talk to just one-on-one, are just incredibly insightful about certain movies,
I've
right?
met people like that for sure. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about you for a minute. What are you working on aside from the normal day-to-day operation stuff? You've got a course on evangelizing the open-minded. Tell me about that.
So that course came out about 4 weeks ago, and it's funny, the genesis of that particular course goes back a couple years, and somebody approached me and challenged me to think about how I might approach speaking to Joe Rogan about religion in a way that he would find compelling. Joe Rogan, as many people will know, is one of the very influential cultural figures right now, and 2 years ago, very much the case as well. And he's somebody who's got some hostilities towards organized religion in general, and Catholicism in particular. He had some experiences as a child in a Catholic school that really scandalized him and I think deeply wounded him. And he's a comedian, and so some of his comedy has been kind of targeting the absurdity of faith and the Catholic Church and things like that. And so obviously Rogan is not the sort of person that's going to be easy to compel. And by compel, I don't necessarily mean convert, right? What I'm trying to do with this course is get somebody to take the claims we're making seriously, or even more fundamentally, getting people to ask the right questions again and ask them seriously. The thing about Rogan, though, is that there's a certain amount of open-mindedness that I think is important to recognize in him, and that's why I find him as a good he serves as a good model for probably a lot of people that we know in our lives who have their hostilities, they have their reservations, whether it's for religious faith in general or whether it's towards the Catholic Church, and they might have good reasons for that. And yet, they are interested in spiritual questions. And that's the case with Rogan. He has different people on his show, and he often brings up topics that are spiritual in nature. And, at times, the comedian kind of comes into play, and there's, or even just like the wounds kind of show themselves, and uses strong language to talk about his contempt for certain aspects of spirituality and Christian spirituality. But from time to time you see that there's also this deep openness, whether it's conversations with Ben Shapiro, who's would have been he's a Jewish guest, but a deeply religious man, or Jordan Peterson, who's not necessarily a confessing Christian or confessing member of an organized religion, and yet insists that we need to take life's big questions, which are inherently religious, very seriously.
Right.
And maybe, more concretely, you need to take the Bible seriously again. You see this deep desire to talk about these things with these people with a certain amount of gravity, and that's admirable in Rogan. And I think we need to find that with the people in our lives that have drifted away from the church or identify as religious nuns. And so, again, going back to the course now, I thought a lot about that challenge because, immediately upon being asked to do this, I thought, oh man, I don't know how in the world I would ever approach that. He seems like a tough egg to crack.
Mm-hmm.
But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this might not be a silver bullet, but I think being formerly somebody who left the church and had, my hostilities against the faith myself, I really dove into that experience and tried to look at Joe Rogan and other people like him to try to discover where are the parallels with my own experience, and then also how was it that I eventually came to kind of move past those things.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm doing with the course in a very large nutshell.
Yeah.
And
I'm curious about the term open-minded, because like Chesterton uses the term. He talks about how an open mind, like an open mouth, must ultimately close on something nourishing,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And so that's like an invitation to say, well, don't just call, being open-minded isn't necessarily a virtue, right? Like ultimately you have to sort of settle on certain things. That having been said, it seems like we live in an age where there are surprisingly few truly open-minded people. Honestly,
Yeah.
I feel like often people they want to rush to judgment about certain things, and then the problem becomes, maybe for the evangelist is changing their mind about something like that.
Yeah.
But Joe Rogan, to me, to come back to him, the thing that I think is his genius, the reason that people really gravitate towards his interviews is he is so genuinely curious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he will not. If somebody says a sentence. His reaction is, "Whoa, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Say more."
Yeah.
He's genuinely. If you're going to put words out into the world, he wants to know what you mean. And so I'm just wondering, is there a certain type of person that you have in mind, then like Joe Rogan, who is naturally like that? This sort of natural, or maybe even a kind of invitation for people to be more curious first, and then kind of talk to them in a way that might make sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's different cultural figures who have prominent platforms on YouTube. People like Dave Rubin who have been on a journey, let's say, intellectually and even to some extent spiritually. Jordan Peterson himself,
Sure,
I think, has been on a pretty extensive journey, visiting these questions that he insists we need to visit. What I admire about Rogan is that, and the rest of these people, is they're interested in dialogue with everybody. So it's hard to put them in a box, right? Because in an age of echo chambers, we tend to put people in a box according to who they talk to. But it's impossible to do it with these people, because they want to step into the realm of ideas with intelligent people who probably disagree with them. And have a genuine conversation, and in many respects, now it's not like they don't have biases.
Right.
It's not like there aren't times. I mean, these are people who do long form
Yeah.
content. They give us plenty of opportunities to spot problems, and so once in a while it might seem like you're not being genuine or you're not being open minded. But I think just the willingness to sit down with people who you're going to disagree with, and have a meaningful conversation with them, and ask genuine questions, and even be fellow journeyers towards the truth and seek together. That is apparent to me with these people.
Yeah.
Bishop Barron has been an example of this as well.
Sure.
In the Catholic world. And when I think of the word open-minded, one of the difficulties is when you create a course, you need a title.
Yeah.
And you want a pithy title.
I think it's a great title, by the way.
Well,
yeah, I love it.
But I like your question because we need to qualify it. Because there's many different ways we can interpret open-minded.
Sure.
I think that the kind of open-mindedness that I am looking for, and that I'm encouraging, and I guess that I'm ordering this course towards, is the kind of open-mindedness that's willing to talk to someone with whom you disagree, with whom you're willing to visit questions together, and somebody who is willing to even potentially change their mind if the proper evidence, or whatever it is that would rationally compel somebody to accept a new idea or change their opinion about something. Somebody who shows some openness towards that. That's really it. And really, like, to bring it down into an even more distilled form, anyone who's willing to have a serious conversation with someone they disagree with, that's who I would consider to be open-minded in this case.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they're always they're not always open-minded.
Right.
I have my days when probably if I'm sitting across from one of my atheist friends, I'm less likely to give them my best and really be genuine in a conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, it seems like like what you're getting at is anybody who's willing to have these conversations is kind of de facto rejecting Pontius Pilate's like infamous "what is truth" thing, right?
Right.
So like at least you have that common ground. And you mentioned this like journeying towards truth thing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me like we should probably, even though we feel very confident about the truth and we believe everything that the church teaches and everything that's been revealed, that we're still able to say, of course we're journeying. Of course we change in certain ways. And I think that that's something that truly open-minded people respect.
Well, here's another thought, is that relativism to me is the biggest fraud. Nobody is relativistic about any, we all care about life's biggest questions, which, are often just referred to as the deepest of human questions. Why are they called human questions? Because we all want to know the answers to them.
Right.
We can Blaise Pascal had a lot of great things to say about this. He says that either we form in ourselves indifference about life's biggest questions so we don't have to face the consequences of changing our lives if these things are true, or we choose diversion and we find ways to distract ourselves from taking things seriously.
Right.
But what going back to the course, what I'm trying to do is also teach people how to form and encourage people to form relationships, because it's only within the greater dimension of relationship and friendship that people, will be open-minded enough to hear you out. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, to be heard out, you need to give that person a lot of your own listening time.
Right.
So that's one of the big elements. I think that even to the most closed-minded people out there, provided they're not like pathologically closed-minded where there's just absolutely nothing you could do, I think any sane human being out there who is conscious and willing to sit down with you for a moment and have a conversation, I think that there are ways to draw out of people a background seriousness that would be way back in in the recesses of their mind.
Yeah.
But we're all rational animals. It's our nature to seek the truth. I think if we're patient enough with people, we're charitable enough with people, and we're really precise about the questions we ask, that we can take even the most indifferent or closed-minded people and get them to become open-minded.
Yeah. I couldn't help but think as you were talking, you mentioned Marshall McLuhan before, and I was thinking about how, he distinguished between hot media and cool media. And his take was cool media is what you have to really convince a person of something. Hot media doesn't work, right? And hot media, sadly, is what we have way too much of in our culture today. It's just people talking past each other. Right. It's all about it's all about being provocative and that kind of thing. Cool media does the exact opposite thing, and it's the most real human encounter. And when you watch a show like Joe Rogan, it is the coolest medium you could imagine. It's two people sitting across a table. They even are wearing headphones and stuff. I mean, there's no artifice to it.
No,
right?
there isn't.
And yet, it's the most popular thing that people clearly want that. They clearly want to have those authentic, cool conversations, right?
Yeah.
And it just seems your course is really opening the door for people to think about how to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what I said earlier, that the course isn't here's how to evangelize Joe Rogan course. When I wrote the course, one of the things that was always on my mind was if Rogan was ever, as this is likely to never happen, but if Rogan was ever to come across the words that I'm speaking as I'm presenting the course, I would want him to not necessarily be excited about the things I'm saying, but be able to say, okay, this guy sounds reasonable. I might not buy that,
right? But
what he's saying, that would be a better approach than the experiences I tend to have with Christians I know,
right?
Because his experience seems to be, not all that open to rational conversation, and we can be guilty of that sometimes, even as disciples of Christ, in that we're supposed to proclaim the gospel, but sometimes we forget that proclaiming the gospel, there is a boldness that we're absolutely called to when we do it.
Yeah.
But there's also, it's always a two-way street, and always hearkening back to St. Peter's demand that he puts on us, that there's always gentleness and reverence that's a part of that.
Yeah.
And part of the reverence aspect of it is to proclaim, but also to be present, to listen, to be also the receiver, and to avoid defensiveness. So, I would hope that if somebody like Rogan were ever to come across this course, I would hope that they would say, like, number one, they would respect it in the sense that I'm not trying to say, oh, this is the silver bullet. Like, if you know Joe Rogan, use these principles and he's going to change his mind, because that's not what I was trying to do. But I'm hoping that people would see that this is a reasonable approach to trying to reach somebody who's been hurt by Christians or by the church, who has wrongful conceptions of what it means to have faith, who's been misled, maybe by Christians, maybe by Catholics, on what our beliefs really are. I would hope that they would see this as a way forward, whether they believe in Christ or not.
Yeah. Something that I know you talk about in the course that might be like a nice connection to the film stuff and some of the stuff I do as well is you talk about beauty as something, as one of the kind of tools, right? That that might be a line of questioning or a topic of conversation, or pointing people towards something who have open minds. Like, how do you talk about that in your course?
So beauty is a hard thing for me as a more analytic apologist. Like, I'm interested by nature in syllogisms. So the argument from beauty is difficult for me, at least. And I remember a few years ago, Bishop Barron sat on a stage with William Lane Craig. Craig, an evangelical philosopher and apologist, somebody who's had many popular debates in public with many of the notorious new atheists, and he continues to do some of this debating now. And so he's got a following, influential on me. And I remember Bishop Barron and William Lane Craig sitting on stage together, just having a discussion like this, and the argument from beauty came up, and Craig really struggled to understand what that meant, because in his area of philosophy of religion and the way that he approaches apologetics, it's a very discursive, syllogistic sort of approach, and so this idea of a more intuitive argument from beauty made very little sense to him. And as much as I wanted to understand what Bishop Barron was saying, I also found myself sympathizing with Craig, and I thought, how do we actually apply this practically if we want to use an argument from beauty? We know that beauty has an evidential power because we have stories about people who, even Bishop Barron himself, there's a sort of coming to the Lord in a deeper way that happened through his experience of the rose window in Paris. So there's we know that beauty does draw people forth. We know in our own experiences there's that arresting quality of it, and that ability to draw us in to even ask questions that can lead us to God. But how does that look like to somebody like a William Lane Craig or myself, who wants to know, but how do we use beauty in a more practical way? That's the question I've been asking for a long time, and the lesson that I have in this course on beauty is, in a sense, where I was at when I filmed it on this question. So it's not necessarily like I'm telling you this is how you draw people to the Lord through beauty,
right?
But it is sort of me saying, here are some ways that I think practically we can take beauty and use it as an approach to evangelization from an apologetic standpoint. And I have a lot more thinking to do about that, but I do think it's a compelling way forward. I'm not entirely sure yet how that looks concretely.
Yeah, it is totally one of those things where you just know kind of intuitively, like, that's right. Lead with beauty. Yeah. The whole Dostoevsky "beauty will save the world" line type of thing, right? It's like that rings true, and yet at the same time, it's like, what does that mean practically, right? Yeah. Because clearly, we have kind of the anecdotal evidence that it works in a sense. Like, there are people's testimonies about being bowled over by some beautiful piece of music, or walking into a beautiful cathedral or something. But there are presumably just as many testimonies of people who have, heard Mozart's Requiem and have been completely unmoved by it, right? So what does that mean, right? It's something that I struggle with when I think about the films that I watch and try and process them through the lens of, like, the truth of our faith. There's an aspect of subjectivity to it. But I guess maybe that's the point, because there is an aspect of subjectivity about everything, in addition to objectivity. Yeah. So it seems to me like, we're both involved in this work of evangelism and apologetics and like all this stuff that kind of all bleeds together, and it seems like there's somewhere in there a kind of a concoction of subjective things, objective things. I mean, I can imagine somebody like me for that matter, could look at a beautiful syllogism, actually, right? I mean, like what a gorgeous argument that is.
Yeah. Well, that is actually very true. I mean, in a sense, there can be a quite direct comparison between mathematics and formal reasoning and logic. And so an argument like the Kalam cosmological argument, which has been one of William Lane Craig's go-to arguments, been extremely persuasive in the area of Christian apologetics. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And then you further infer that cause, being prior to time, space, matter, and energy, must be timeless, spaceless, eternal, so on and so forth. Yeah. So that argument in itself is what I would consider elegant and in that sense beautiful, and sort of the way I think that mathematicians talk about a beautiful equation. So that's a really good point. I want to also say that people like me have to be careful, because the error that we're in danger of making is that the only way to convince somebody is through a syllogism, or that apologetics is only about demonstrations. Sometimes we have to kind of let things do we almost have to step back and let things work on people themselves. There's a way in which beauty might best be understood from an apologetic standpoint as the answer to the problem of evil and suffering. Because we look at some things in our world and we say, well, if that's the case, then God couldn't possibly exist. Right. And sometimes we get so caught up in that argument, which is, it's notoriously persuasive, and it has been for as long as human beings have been aware of moral evils and natural evils and that sort of thing. It's always been a scandal. Like for us, it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. So, but how often do we take the time to also consider saints as the counter argument, or beauty? And there's also a connection between the life of a saint, the goodness that they portray, and objective beauty. And that gets us into the conversation about transcendentals and how there's this intrinsic unity between truth, goodness, and beauty. Right. But talk about, let's go back to film for a second, because I'm interested to know, like, two questions. Number one, what's the most beautiful film you've ever seen? And number two, which film do you think is most evangelically important from the perspective of the beauty that it portrays? Yeah. Those are great questions. I mean, I just wanted to touch on this issue of the problem of evil, and I'll connect it up with films too. There's a line in the movie Manhattan where the main character Isaac says to one of the female character Tracy, he says, "You're God's answer to Job." And it's sort of that she sort of has this innocence and radiance and beauty, and the plot's more complicated than that, and and that sort of thing. But it's a really beautiful line, and it sort of speaks to what you're saying. There are these moments that we all recognize. We all do. I really do think, whether we're confessing believers or not, whether we're tortured by the problem of evil or not, where we can experience something or see something where we go, okay, there's all this pain and suffering and it's awful, but there's also that. Yeah. So, so a movie that does that for me is, among many others, but is the movie Life is Beautiful, which is... Oh, is that the one in the concentration camp? Yeah. I mean, so, it's about this man, this indomitable force of joy, and the man happens to be Jewish, not Christian, but it's this beautiful movie about this man who he woos this woman and marries her, and she's very wealthy, and her family rejects her, and they have a child together, and it's right on the cusp of World War II, and so the father and his son get shipped off to a concentration camp. The woman, who's not Jewish, goes too, and she's there in solidarity with her family, and there are all these little moments in the film where Guido, the main character, just refuses. He refuses to give in to the darkness that is overwhelming him, and that would obviously just do almost all of us in, right? So there's this moment where he
he finds this record player, and at pain of losing his life, he rigs it up to this speaker and he plays this beautiful opera music that goes all through the concentration camp all of a sudden. And like that's his vocation really, is to like bring beauty into this like hopeless place. So
yeah, and what I remember from that film, and this is one of the few films that I do remember well after. And I only watched it one time too, but which maybe speaks to the beauty of it and the fact that it was able to infuse itself into my memory. But I remember also the way that ugly things are happening all around, and the father is able to translate without lying to his child a beautiful way of seeing what's happening, so that the child continues to have peace in his heart, and because the child is too naive to really understand what's going on. And the father's kind of almost trying to protect his innocence through these translations.
He creates this game where everything that happens on a particular day is them actually being victorious over the people, he creates this whole game, which is, I think, honestly, a beautiful metaphor for the Christian life. That we believe Christ has conquered sin and death, and so therefore we have to deal with all kinds of awfulness. But what if we thought of all of that stuff? And it's so much easier said than done. But what if we thought of all of that stuff as sort of just part of this game, in a sense, that the Lord has given us to play until we join Him, right? Life is Beautiful is just one of those that absolutely does it for me.
So is that the most beautiful movie you've ever seen, or is that the movie that you would say is one of the most advantageous films for somebody to see from an evangelical perspective, that you think it would really capture the heart and mind of someone who doesn't believe and maybe compel them to ask questions?
I would say both. I think that Roberto Benigni made an absolutely beautiful movie with that, But I mean, among just purely aesthetic, beautiful movies that I've seen, there are so many. Bernardo Bertolucci's film Stealing Beauty is another one that I just think, it's set in the Tuscan countryside, and it's just gorgeous. And some of the great directors have Federico Fellini and Ingmar Bergman and stuff. I mean, they've made just beautiful, almost sort of living paintings, and there's so many other great directors like that. Paolo Sorrentino is an Italian director who's done that. He made a movie called The Great Beauty, and he's done some stuff for TV. And it's really just like he's painting these beautiful pictures. So there's so much beautiful stuff out there. And, part of me just really wants to put those things on people's radar so that they don't always have to settle for the same old look, which is what honestly pops up, especially in a lot of the streaming dramas and stuff like that. I mean, these things are made kind of in a particular way, and they have a particular look, and they're fine. But rarer are these pieces of art, but they're there, they exist, and you could spend your whole life just watching that stuff if you wanted to, if you knew where to find it.
How do you know that it's a piece of art? How do you know that this is a good film? Because I'm curious, when the Vatican film list was put together, I mean, there had to have been some form of criteria. But it's not obvious when you glance at the film.
No, it's not obvious. And there's always some degree of subjectivity to that, for sure. I mean, I think that with something like the Vatican film list, and for me as a Christian viewer of films, I'm certainly always looking for something that, even if it's not at all overtly Christian, still has that kind of shape of the gospel to it. That still is basically telling the story of of death and resurrection. That's telling that story of charity, of virtue, right? So it's tough to say, and we're not always going to agree on all of those things. And sometimes I take flack for things that I write. I'll write something that people will say, "Oh gosh, actually that isn't a very appropriate movie for a Catholic to watch." And I'll say, "Well, you might be right. Honestly, you probably are. I don't know always, but I know as a Catholic, I can just sort of tell you what I think I'm seeing and what you might see if you decide to engage with that. But there's always going to be some degree of subjectivity to it.
Yeah. Well, I guess my last question for you is, going back to your commentaries, how did you choose the films that you did? And I know you're probably not going to get too specific here at this point, but how do you choose, in this case, which films are worthy of the time and effort that you put into this?
Well, I'll give a couple of teasers. I mean, some of them are really obvious popular things like Star Wars, and some of them are movies that people have never heard of, probably, like Louis Malle's movie My Dinner with Andre, things like that. And honestly, the way that I chose the movies was, for whatever reason, all the movies that I did for the commentaries are movies that stick in my brain, that I can't get out of my head, that I think about pretty often. And I think to myself, well, if these movies are in my head, the directors did something right. They have created something that has been built to last. Now, not all of these films are edifying for the Christian life, but I engage with them in a way that draws out things that I think might be. So basically, I just picked movies that really matter to me. And that's a big piece of my work, to be honest with you, Matt, is not only being an evangelist for Christ and his kingdom, spreading the good news of God and Jesus Christ, but also like trying to be something of an evangelist, if I can use that word, for film itself, right? Sort of saying to people, hey, look, there's all this stuff out there. You may have never heard of this, or maybe you've seen this, but you never thought about it in this way. I'm happy to help if that's something that can be like beneficial to you in your life.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, I think that unless you've got some parting words, I think we should end this first ever Footnotes with the Fellows. So for all of you, we want to thank you for joining us for this conversation, this Footnotes with the Fellows, and there's going to be more to come, so you can look forward to more interesting conversations between the Word on Fire Institute Fellows. I want to encourage all of you to go to our YouTube page, go to the Word on Fire Institute YouTube page and subscribe. And there you'll see all everything we're releasing, and a lot of good stuff there now and to come. And of course, join us in the Word on Fire Institute, where you can see all of the work that Andrew is doing, as well as all the other Word on Fire fellows, and Bishop Barron, of course. So just go to wordonfire.institute and sign up there as well. And we hope to see you inside. God bless all of you.